my name is Katherine Fauvre, and I'm here to answer some questions as to how I see the Enneagram Tritypes, how they began, what became important initially, and then what has become more important over time. So, to begin with, the questions I'm often asked are: what are tritypes? What is the tritype? How do I find my tritype? How do I identify my tritype and the tritypes of others? What's important? And what is the tritype archetype? Well, to begin with, I thought of tritype in terms of three types. In fact, that was my original name for the three types that I found that everyone seemed to use. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the Enneagram types seem to run in threes. How did I gather that information? From the standpoint of interviewing many people sequentially over a very short period of time, originally about 500 people, starting with 400 that knew their Enneagram type and 100 that did not. In that first 400, I found that people use the core fears of three Enneagram types, not just one. Now, how did I determine that? Well, as I was doing these in-depth typing interviews, I discovered that people identified three core fears. Now, I had studied core fears long before I knew the Enneagram, long before I applied those clusters to Enneagram types. I also knew microexpressions. I also knew body language. I knew faciology, Myers-Briggs, and so on. I have always been someone that has studied and tried to fully understand many, many typologies. Now, obviously, over that period of time, I found some typologies more meaningful to me than others. And I really liked all of them. But once I found the Enneagram, I discovered what linked all these other typologies together. And how did that happen? It happened because it named a complete kind of understanding of personality types. Now, all of us kind of know a certain kind of type. Yeah, I know that type of person. They do this, or they do that, or that's an introvert, or that's an extrovert, or yeah, that's someone that really shoots for success. That's someone that really gets along with others. So I had about 7 of the Enneagram types. And more importantly, I had the 3 instinctual types. And how did I know that? I knew that because when I worked with people one-on-one and helping them work with their image presentation and style, whether they wanted to have clothing to feel more confident, or whether they had to go to an interview or be questioned on a witness stand, any type of situation you can imagine. I worked with people's inner experience and outward expression. And that included how they saw the world and ways to recognize universal truths that all people identify with, as well as how they could dress in clothing, colors, and styles that were equally empowering. So it isn't just knowing how to speak or how to handle a situation, but it's looking credible. It's looking like yourself, where you match and you seem like someone that would know what you're talking about. Now, understandably, as an 8, I was very focused on personal empowerment in that field. And I happened to fall into it. It wasn't where I intended to be at all. But once I did, I could easily see where I wanted to go with that information. And I wanted to go the way of empowering others. And if you think about the core fear of 8, it's about being disempowered, not having the power to prevail in your own world, in your own environment, and wanting to be master and commander of your life, be the sole decision maker. getting all the data, and then making the decision yourself. So in that process, I found the Enneagram. Now, when I was a manager and a regional manager in the cosmetic industry in the early part of my career, I went and attended every course I could find on personality so that I could manage people that seemed so unbelievably different from myself. So the way that people looked at others or what they quarreled about would baffle me because I could understand some quarrels, but in the cosmetic industry, there weren't many eights overall. If you consider all 9 types, it was one of the smallest sectors. And the reason for that is that it's not where the attention of the 8 goes. And those 8s that were in the cosmetic industry that I came into contact with all had 4 in their tritype, and many were sexual. Now, why does that become important? Because we can identify with wanting to be attractive. That's the sexual instinct. So, needless to say, I ended up in the cosmetic industry and was quickly promoted and needed these skills. So, as I found these typologies, they all were helpful. And I had recognized several kind of types of people. But also, when I found the Enneagram, what was so meaningful is that the Enneagram explained these personality styles in a more complete way. So it took a lot of the mystery out of why someone was doing what they were doing, because anyone can have good or bad behavior. And certainly we all know that we're better at sometimes than we are others. But what is the factor that makes the difference? What are we trying to do, know, or understand, or just simply express? And if we have unmet needs, all of us can potentially behave less than ideal. But what I found with the Enneagram is that if I really worked with a lot of people, and I did, and initially I just interviewed people as I needed to. But once I decided I wanted to understand what we needed to know about the types and the internal experience of type, not what an expert says about the types, but what they say about themselves, I rapidly moved through 400 people that knew the Enneagram. When I went to the Stanford conference in 1994, I had the opportunity of meeting a diverse group of people that were all different Enneagram types. And I was able to quickly gather a bigger mailing list and enlist the support of these people in discovering what we needed to know about the types. So I began by sending out a questionnaire that I had used actually when I was trying to hire people. And it was just simply, give me 5 adjectives you would use to describe yourself to a complete stranger. And it was amazing. People couldn't use a thesaurus. They couldn't ask someone. They had to come up with it in the interviewing process. And the same was true with my interviewing them for the Enneagram, because I found that it revealed so much about the person, because it wasn't, are you this or this? It was, who are you? Who do you know yourself to be? And what are these 5 qualities that would say the most about you to a total stranger? And we can't help but reveal at least some aspect of our Enneagram type, our personality style. So it reveals where our attention goes. And in that process of doing all that work with understanding typologies, I came upon a way of understanding the core fears. Now, one of the questions I asked is, what is your greatest strength and why? And what is your greatest weakness and why? And whatever the weakness was, I asked them to explain what they perceived they would be afraid of, the irrational fear. And I developed these clusters of fears that went together. So when I found the Enneagram, it was very easy for me to recognize the fears according to type. And then later, other people with their books came out with core fears or a single fear for each Enneagram type. So that part was easy for me. But then I discovered that if we knew the core fear, then we could more effectively get access to the type. Now, what I learned working with people and interviewing them is that when these core fears arise, it's because we can't allow ourselves to go into it. So our defense strategy will come in and divert us. And I see this as the superego, the primary ego that's kind of in charge of all the mini egos. But where I'm going with this is that many times these three core fears were related to a type and maybe a wing type. So I could say, oh, well, that's because it's a wing type, and I just have to determine which is dominant. But there could be a third one that had no connection to a wing or a line of connection that was totally unrelated to the other two types that I found that were related. And then more and more, I'd find three unrelated types. And I knew it was too consistent to not be meaningful. So what I did is I found 100 people that didn't know the Enneagram at all, would never want to know the Enneagram. They weren't even interested in typologies. And it was only because I persuaded them to help me out and let me interview them that they did. So we could say I had the power of influencing them. But they were people who knew me, but they hadn't had me interview them in this way in terms of defining Enneagram type. So when I started tracking these patterns, another piece became very clear to me. And that was that the three types that they chose were actually in one per center. So it would be three types, but they would be in different centers. Now, there were some people, especially sixes, that had fears of maybe four types. And then that could be what they identified with. But overall, if I went deeper and used my deep inquiry process, we could get around the superego and find out what all the egos really felt. Now, this was really a breakthrough for me in understanding the types. Yet I didn't know anyone that knew about this. So I just worked with my clients using it. And what do I mean by that? Is that if I worked with clients on a single issue or using a single solution, it could be very helpful. But if I use the three fears and the three idealized images that they had, it was much more effective in problem solving. And if they had four types, I would just figure out when there were two in the same center, which of those two was more dominant. And then that actually matched what later has become Tritype. But shortly thereafter, within like a year and a half, I began this in 94. So at the end of 96, I found out from Jack and Andrea Labanuskas when they were writing Enneagram Monthly that when they interviewed Oscar Chazo earlier that year in the summer, that he had talked about trifix and gave them their trifix. And I thought, whoa, that's meaningful. Where can we find more? And they didn't know. But at the same time, within, a month's period of time, I went to a special event hosted by the IEA Northern California, where an Enrican, that's someone who's studied under Oscar Chazo, and the school that was founded in his name was Eureka Institute. But this teacher was actually teaching on psychocalisthenics, according to Chazo. But while she was teaching it, she made a comment, "I'm so glad that I know about my trifix because my anger, my kinesthetic visceral response is very 8, and I never quite understood it as a 5 because it would be so strong." But when Chazo started giving people their trifix around that time, not everyone at the same time. In fact, I really hadn't met anyone else that knew their trifix till later. But that moment in time, I waited and talked to her after that morning session and said, "Where can I find more? I see 3 types, one in each center. And I think it's what Ichazo is teaching. Where can I find more information?" She also said nothing was published and that all she knew was that they'd been told they have 3 types, which were actually fixation. So it wasn't the full type, it was the fixation within each type, and that it moved in a clockwise order. So if you were an 8, for example, and you were an 8-7-4 like I am, you'd actually name it 8-4-7 because it would be going in the clockwise order. And that these 3 fixations constantly move and shape the way we view the world. Now, that's my terminology, but that's what I walked away with. And until Jack and Andrea disseminated their interview, where there were 2 paragraphs about Ichazo talking about trifix, nothing really had been documented. So I thought, well, I need to find out more about this, talk to the people that I have worked with, and discover what is really important for all of us. And I had done research at the same time with those questionnaires. And when I got this information, I went back into those questionnaires to see if I could see more about their type and potential tri-type. And sure enough, in the questions that I had on that Enneagram questionnaire, very often there would be the language of all 3 types. Now, I found it in the interview process where I would be going down and getting around the superego in a very specific way where someone could just blurt something that's important to them or a core fear. But if we're trying to name something we already know, it doesn't really work. We can begin there, but what we need to do is get to what people don't know that they would say, or they're about to say it and then they stop and don't say it, because that's more indicative of type. That's the defense strategy at work. When I met with clients and used this, they obviously had a lot more questions. So I started teaching this in addition to the Enneagram. I learned about the Enneagram in 1985, but I didn't do this research till after the 1994 conference. From there, I just started gathering data and organizing it in a more specific way. And when I interviewed people, I was looking for their 3 types, even if they didn't get to it right away. You can find it. But what was noteworthy and of interest is the instinct was always really dominant. And when I followed up with research on the instincts, that proved to be true. That if you really said, okay, what triggers you more? What causes you to show the low side of your type or your, in this case, then tri-type? It was always when an unmet need felt so strong and, in a sense, life-threatening if it wasn't met, then they would go into defense in a more specific way, like we would now describe as the Tritype. So that's a little background on it. I will be able to weave in more as we go, but I promise to add kind of a little description that I have for those of you who don't know really about Tritype, or perhaps you know about the concept, but you haven't learned it from me, or you haven't talked to me in many years and did not know what I've added or what I found is even more important than what I did initially. Because when I first found Tritype, I called it three types, as I mentioned. But then when I found Ichazo's trifix, I thought, well, basically, we're both saying that you have a type in each center and you use all three and that they're constantly in motion. So I thought, why confuse people? There were already other areas of the Enneagram that were somewhat confusing. So I thought, I'll just call it trifix and give Ichazo attribution because I assumed I had found what he had already found. But what I discovered over time and from the Eurekans, the people in his school, is that he really did only use the fixation, that he never taught anybody about using the whole type. And by that, I mean the passion, the fixation, the conviction, in other words, the heart, head, and gut of each type, and the motion within the Enneagram type, which would be the wings, going back and forth constantly like a little machine from the type out and back, type out and back, out and back, out and back. So they're just a little off from each other, but it's like an engine and gears in motion that are turbocharged. And the same would happen to the lines of connection. So that's a dynamic aspect of the Enneagram. It's what propels the Enneagram forward. So I was able to determine that these tritypes became a type unto themselves, but to what degree I didn't know. In the beginning, I knew for sure that it modified the way we looked at the type. So if people had the same Enneagram type, we could see the differences according to their instinct, their dominant instinct. Now, again, in 1985, the viewpoint was that you had one instinct, and it was a minor factor that the Enneagram type was the most important. But this factor could give you the energy needed for transformation, but it was a visceral energy. Now, what I found out was that with the instincts, this is all going on simultaneously with the same body of research. I couldn't really separate, okay, this is the instinctual type part and the subtypes. Oh, and this is the three centers, three types part. It just was emerging at the same time. And that's how I came up with the stacking order, because it wasn't just that we had one instinctual type. We stacked them in a preferred order. And knowing that stacking had a lot to do with how we show up according to our Enneagram type. And the same was true with these three types, and they're in a stacking order. And I learned that both of them can be positively or negatively identifying by the person, by the individual. So someone could be positively identified with this sexual instinct if they grew up being told their whole lives, aren't you cute? Aren't you attractive? You're going to be a heartbreaker. Whatever people heard, they had confidence in the way they negotiated the world and were seen as desirable, as attractive. But you could also be negatively identified. And what I mean by that is you might not feel attractive enough, or maybe you never had any mirroring that you were desirable or attractive in any way. And then you might be negatively identified. Even if you went to the effort to be attractive, you wouldn't think of it as an area of strength without considering how you dressed, how you adorned yourself, what details were important to you, what about your personality need to be sparkling in a way. And then from there, you might compensate for that negative identification. Now, that's true with all three instincts and all three types in your tritype. So back to the description, the question is like, what are your types? What are your tritypes? How do I find my tritype? What is a tritype archetype? And why are there 27? Well, the term tritype refers to a 27-point typing system that I found that is an advanced approach to the Enneagram. And it gives a more specific focus of attention. Because if you're looking at the idealized image and the core fear of three types, when they come together, you're going to have a more specific viewpoint. And this varies according to the tritype. So if you happen to have 1, 3, and 5, for example, you're going to have an idealized image. I'm a good person. I do what's right. I'm responsible. I'm thorough. I'm willing to work hard and do what's called for. That's the idealized image. But if you make a mistake and you're wrong in some way, then the corresponding core fear is I am wrong, bad, evil, corruptible, unethical, and the opposite of those words. So if you had 1 in the tritype, that would be a factor. Then if you had 3, it would be focused on I'm great, I do my best, I'm a winner, I'm a taskmaster, I get things done quickly and efficiently and accomplish a great deal. And underneath that, I'm striving for admiration from others for doing that. And the core fear is that you'll be unadmired, that you will fail, that you won't meet the standards of the number 1 or the top 10%, because that's essential to the 3. In fact, in the interviewing, I said, well, what is failing? And I was astounded that people from different countries, different walks of life, said some version of second best. Whoa, I never had that issue personally. I was glad if I was in that top 10% or doing a good job or a decent job. But I didn't want to work that hard to be number 1. And when I found that people who did were not necessarily really gifted and smart, but they worked really hard, I thought, oh, wow, I just don't want to work that hard. But what I learned is that we will put that energy into something we enjoy, not what we're told to enjoy at a certain time. But those that need that admiration will work hard to get their grades to give them that, or their behavior to give them that by doing something. So all heart types do something to get that good feeling and that admiration from others. They're dependent on others giving it to them. So in the head type, if someone is a 5 in this tritype, then they are going to focus on what information they need to know, what data is meaningful, how much they should collect, and what they should try and understand, and what the concept is and the individual parts and how they interact and go together. And the core idealized image is that they are intelligent and they have that capability. The core fear is that they will be ignorant, that there's something they won't know that they should know, or they don't have enough data, that they would not just make a mistake or be wrong, but that they would be without the skills, knowledge, and information they needed to be self-sufficient. So it wasn't enough to do a good job. In fact, they often did a good job, but what was more important was being self-sufficient, not dependent on anyone. So a major core fear that emerged was a fear of being invaded and needing people to be further out. Now, I could go a lot into all three of those types, but in this case, to say more about tritype, it's like, what happens when they come together? Well, none of them want to be wrong. None of those three types, for three different reasons, want to be wrong or make a mistake. But the gut type, the one is saying, we need to improve, but we have to focus on what we need to do to improve. And we can't be wrong, bad. So how are we going to make sure we're not wrong or bad? Is try and understand exactly what's needed and do our best job, because we should. Whereas the three is saying, I need to do a great job to be the best. Can't make a mistake. Who do you admire that makes a mistake? We're really only as good as our last touchdown, 2 or 3. And they see themselves as their last accomplishment. Now, even though they may have had many accomplishments, the defense strategy starts looking for a new one, a new goal, a new way to get that good feeling and to be admired by others. Okay, so they both need to do a good job. Then the 5 naturally wants to be thorough and do a good job, but it's also based on their interest. They like using their mind as a way to manage their defense strategy. Now, they're unconscious of that, as we all are, of our primary motivators. But in the case of the 5, they're using their ability to conceptualize as a strategy, where the other 2 types aren't. But if they all go together, they all want to do their best, be their best, and know whatever they need to know. And they all work really hard. So if someone has the 3 together, you can guarantee that's what the focus is going to be for the tritype. And it's going to be more specific than the 1, the 3, or the 5 alone. And it's holistic because there's one from each center. So it addresses the head, the heart, and the gut right off the top. So what else can I say about this? We use all 3 centers, but it's important to note that we use them in a specific, very specific, oscillating, repeating, hierarchical order. So it's a descending model that is of 27 variables, because 3 times 9 is 27. Just like with the subtypes, you have 9 types and 3 variables, which is also 27. It's amazing when you put them together, by the way, because you have the core fear of each, and it equals our focus of attention. And in the case of the tritype, extensive research with the first 400, 500, and now tens of thousands of participants that began in 1994 has revealed like character traits, not behaviors, although there might be some that we notice with one type more than another, just as we do with Enneagram type. But just as with Enneagram type, we cannot determine a tritype based on behaviors. We can't determine an Enneagram type based on behaviors, because anybody could have good or bad behaviors. Why they're acting out in that behavior or showing themselves in that way. And if we know the difference between something as simple as introversion, extroversion, you know what I'm talking about. We can recognize someone who's more held in and someone who's, hey, how are you doing? And very comfortable talking to anyone, anytime, any place, anywhere. And the key thing I discovered is that these traits reflect not just the wings, the lines of connection, but it also creates a new set of core values, needs, fears, and concerns, new core triggers, more specific core triggers. So if you have a more specific core trigger, it's easier to work with your type and to begin to unlock the part of it that gets jammed and on automatic. And we can say, oh, yeah, I noticed that when this subject comes up, or if someone doesn't respect me, I feel tense. And when I'm tense, I start to get more definite. That would be in my case. And what would trigger that? If someone lied to me, and not just lying, but lying to get out of doing something that they should reasonably do. And it would feel like, what, you're trying to pull one over on me? And why are you lying? What else are you not telling me? So that's the nature of 8. But someone else might be more focused on another aspect, like that 135 would be focused on what's most efficient. How can I get things done? And the 135, none of those 3 types want to be really personal. They're more related to what they're doing, their research of the 5, or their investigation of something. By the way, 6s see themselves as investigators as well, but they're not doing it just for the sake of a particular subject that they need to understand for themselves. The 6 is doing it to alleviate uncertainty, to find out what other people are doing. We have to look back to before there was the internet. How did you find out the information you perceived you needed to have? And the 6s would ask other people, well, what would you do in this situation? Or what do you think I am? Do you see this out in the world? You get some type of confirmation for what they were looking at or how they wanted to answer a question. Now, the other thing is that the tritype gives us a more specific blind spot so we can discover what we can't see. It really takes knowing your tritype or someone pointing it out to you. And we may or may not believe that person. So I felt it was really important to collect this data and help people in the typing process because it was so good at getting to that particular area that we maybe would have troubles regularly with people, because we get in trouble when we hit a core fear, especially when something does not match our idealized image. So if we perceive that we are a productive person, like the 135, if they're not producing, they feel anxious. They feel dis-ease. If they're a 7 and they're not having fun and having enjoyable experiences, even if it's learning, they want learning to be enjoyable, then they feel uncomfortable. And that's when they'll tease and be sarcastic to lighten the mood, because they need to feel inspired. They need to feel like life is a banquet and you can find, whatever you enjoy. But if you stay with the negative things in life, it's very stressful. So the 7s don't want to go into negative emotion. But other types, like the 4 and 6, look towards negative emotions as a starting point to try and find out what they need so that it doesn't happen again. And both 4 and 6 have a fear of abandonment in a slightly different way, but both want to know they have the person that makes them feel safe. So if we put it together and think of another example like the 478, I also looked at what the 3 types shared in common in terms of their position within a center. And the 3, 7, and 8 are the assertive types in each center, the can-do types, whereas the 4, 7, 8 is the creative type in each center. Just by changing from 3 to 4, it shifts over to a new perspective. So how is that interesting? Well, the 3, 7, 8 is focused on building something big. overcoming an obstacle like an 8, seeking an efficient way of doing things like a 3, and having a vision like a 7. So that's why they become these people that build communities if they're social, build businesses, or whatever they do, they want to do it bigger and better. Whereas the 4, 7, 8 is, wait a minute, I need something more specific, something more exclusive. And the other thing, when you have 4, 7, and 8, it's the type that is the change element in their center, the assertive type in a certain way. So 4 is going to be outspoken about their passions, and they're going to have a passion for protest. They're going to speak up when something does not ring true for them. And the 7 wants the unusual, but so does the 4. So there are two types that want the unusual. They're creative. They describe themselves as creative. In fact, the type most inclined to put creative on their questionnaire are those 3 types, but the 7 most of all. And then the 8 is solving problems the way they come up with solving it. So they're creative problem solvers. If you have these 3 types, you're not just creative or a problem solver, you're a creative, out of the box problem solver. And this is because this tritype is looking for the new, the novel, the different, the way 7 does. But there are 2 other types that are supporting that vision or viewpoint. And there's the can-do quality of 8 and the need for that unusual aspect that 4 and 7 want. And the 8 is the unusual type in their center and really on the Enneagram, because there's a lot of energy with the 8. They can be perceived as very heroic in tough situations, but they can also seem like too much, too loud, too, and not easy to be around when the 8 is in their definite posturing. But that's true of 4. And in a way, that's true of 7. If a 7 feels inferior, they're going to suddenly stop being an egalitarian and take the person or situation that's making them feel inferior in their mind and become superior to that. So they'll put down what does not agree with their view. Who else does this? The 4 in their respective center and the 8 in their respective center. So needless to say, the 4, 7, 8 becomes a nonconformist and a creative, futuristic problem solver, out of the box problem solver, where the 3, 7, 8, it's got the formulas, they're employing them, they're using them according to their type, and the focus is something big, even if they're an introvert. But if they're social, wow, they're going to go big. And there are all kinds of variables I want to share with you, but that'll take me off course. So I discovered that actually looking at the tritype archetype itself was even more important than the way the type was modified by the types it shared. So in the early work, I pointed out how an 8 would be different based on the 9 different ways and combinations the 8 could have, or the 6, or the 3, or the 2, or the 1. So I'd say, okay, if 8 has 4, that's a more emotional 8. If an 8 has 3, more results oriented. So again, it's formulaic. And any formula that we use, if we identify the qualities properly, yields a lot of information because it's how you organize those facts and concepts and how you put them together. What do they create? And again, the tritype archetype is creating this new factor. Now, a lot of people ask me what you need to understand about your own tritype and how you type accurately. Well, this is especially hard for the 6 and 9, just as it is with their primary type. And this is because their defense strategy is organized around adapting and understanding and using universal understandings of things. So the 3 wants to be the ideal image of success wherever they are in life and whatever they're doing. And the 6 wants to be kind of the ideal everyman, the boy or girl next door that everyone feels comfortable with and thinks highly of. And the 9 wants to be the ideal person that's liked by everyone. And the way they do that is to not be conflictual, to deny their own desire to conflict over an issue in service of being seen as someone that they like, that's easygoing, that's uncomplicated. So they want to adapt to circumstances so they will have goodwill and affection. In fact, all types are using their defense strategy to get the love or attention they need to feel like they can survive. So finding the tritype and accurately. So if 9 and 6 are going to inadvertently identify with their behaviors, tritype won't work as well for them. In fact, initially, 75% of people found that when they learned their tritype, they learned something really important about themselves that they knew was always there, but once named, gave them access to using it to better understand life, people, situations, etc. But if they had the 369, they were inclined to say, well, I kind of already knew that. And of course they would, because the 3, 6, and 9 have lines to each other. So they wouldn't have found it as breakthrough information the way the other types would. So I went back and looked at that 25% that said that, and that was the tritype they had. Or they had 2 of those 3 types. And when I looked further and interviewed them further, they actually were that tritype. But because those 3 types will choose a type they identify with, they would not recognize it. But they would know that they identify with the qualities of 3, 6, and 9, even if they thought they were a 4, 6, 9 or a 4, 7, 9. It could be any variable. But we have to look at how you run your heart energy, how you run your head energy, and how you run your gut energy. So in the beginning, I thought, wouldn't it be perfect if we could have a type that had an instinct so that we could very easily have 3 types, each with their own instinct, and we'd have a perfect little system, be very elegant. But unfortunately, my interviewing processes revealed that the instinct is so strong that we have to look at self-pres. Let's say someone's self-pres 3, 7, 8. They have to look at self-pres 3, self-pres 7, and self-pres 8 first. But on a more sophisticated level later on, you can begin to see that ideal pattern that I wanted to have is in play, but that the dominant instinct is truly dominating the whole defense strategy. It triggers it and then it moves away, so to speak. And as long as we feel like we're resolving a problem, we're good, all of us. But if our types and our tritype have an important factor that's not matching, like someone that has the 4, 7, 8, like myself, the 7 and the 8 are looking towards reality or the future At the very least, they have to stay optimistic. They might call something off if they're an 8-7 or 7-8, but the 8 wants to call it off, the 7 wants to move beyond it. So if there's 4 in the tri-type, the 4s need to process what upsets them and what they didn't get or what isn't there. They want to point out what's missing and be able to name it because it makes them feel better. And why is that? Because their defense strategy is based on seeing what's missing and going in search of it. And if they find it, it's extraordinary. And if they don't, they're going to keep trying and keep trying to find that thing that completes them. But it's an endless journey because the 4 isn't meant to do that. The 4 is meant to see what's missing, go in search of it. And when they get there, it won't answer all their problems and they'll go in search again. And we'll see this really in particular when the 4, 6, and 9 come together. All 3 are searching, but they don't really like to make a decision. And they all share doubt. But in the searching process, they find answers to their questions, but those answers raise new questions. So the first thing they can understand is they don't necessarily need to find an answer. And there's nothing wrong with them that they don't find an answer. Just as there's nothing wrong with the 6, 4, 9 that is thinking negatively, thinking, what can go wrong is probably going to go wrong. And actually they doubt themselves, doubt others, and might have a negative perspective. But that's because they're searching for their true perspective that matches them. So each tri-type is coming from a certain position and a way in which they need to maneuver in the world. And if our 3 types are in agreement, we make decisions like that. None of us have to waste any time mulling it over, even if we're a 6 or a 9. We don't have to ruminate like a 9, and we don't have to second guess. But what'll happen with the 6 or the 3 or the 9 is they just want to double check. They just want to make sure. But they know immediately when it feels right. It's just part of their defense strategy to have certainty. But the other types in the tri-type that are hexad types, 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, and 7, any combination of those, when the types agree and they make that snap decision, that's it. They don't need to think further. They don't need to go beyond it because their types are organized around discovering what that is and then acting on it. They don't have that need to adapt and change and check it out, double check. And that's really important to know, that we're not crazy when we can't make a decision. It could be because we have 6 and 9 in the tri-type, but it could also be that our types are divided. So if my 7 and 8 want to be positive and optimistic, and my 4, which is third for me and very small stacking of it, I'm not going to really be able to listen to the emotional needs because 8 and 7 do not. They do not allow emotions to interfere with their kind of strength and enjoyment in life, their ability to overcome an obstacle and to move forward. Whereas emotions that a 4 might express will hold them back. Some people need to point out the negative to be able to move forward, or several negatives. And that will be difficult for like the 3, 7, 8. It's like, no, you're slowing me down. Emotions are like speed bumps. I need to move forward. Whereas the 4, 6, 9 will be, no, let's backtrack on that. Are we certain? Are we sure that this is the right way to go? I'm doubting it. So at least the 469, even if they struggle with making decisions, it's congruent. There are enough qualities that are the same that makes their process and processes manageable in one way and difficult in another. So we have to look at the splits when there are two in sync and look at that third type in the tritype that has a totally different view. And usually it's third, but not always. So with respect to the tritype, I could go on for a very long time and explain how meaningful it is, and that this tritype archetype is more important than the individual's tritype because it's a whole archetype. It's not just one or two factors. And this is where obviously it's very different from trifix. So in 2007, when I was speaking to people from Eureka, and I wanted to find a way to separate our work, and they wanted to find a way to trademark trifix. Now, because I had used it, they couldn't trademark it unless I took my term off and let them have it. Because the way trademark works is who's ever used it the longest and the most has priority. But if it's in the public domain without someone copywriting it, which of course I did originally, they said not only should you copyright it, and of course intellectual property is copywritten, but the internet had not really come into being. Once that happened, people had access everywhere and could just start taking data and using it without naming the source or what have you. Now, I always named a Chazo when I did Trifix. I always gave him attributions. So that helped. And then they were able to go after the trademark. So when we decided, okay, what's the difference? How can we do this to meet my need? Because all the information that I disseminated came from me. None of it came from a Chazo. But people assume because I gave them attribution for the term that everything I wrote was from a Chazo. And then they further disseminated what I wrote without stating that or recognizing that it came from me. And what became problematic is that someone would post what I wrote about a particular type. And then they'd say, well, I'm not tri-type and I don't feel that way. And they'd repost and then put new sentences in that matched them. Now, what they didn't realize is they weren't that tri-type. And that's why it didn't match them. And what they were adding was indicative of their actual tri-type. But they didn't know that. And I hadn't published much on that. You had to be in a class with me to understand that. But anyhow, when that was disseminated, people missed the importance of the tritype itself, that it isn't just what we identify with. So I leave with you how important it is to define the three types according to the actual defense strategies you use, not what you relate to or identify with. You can begin there, but you cannot choose or determine a tritype or a type for that matter based on identification. In fact, it's very misleading and leads us astray. So good luck on your journey with tritype. I am posting little mini versions that will be available for you to check out. And you'll be able to see the collages, and they're all on YouTube, on Katherine Fauvre, creator of Tritype, or at katherinefauvre.com. And if you have not taken my test, I have created a test based on the way the tens of thousands of people take tests. And again, 6 and 9 do not do well in testing instruments because they want balance. So if they answered with one answer the first go, or the cards, choose one card. If it comes up again, they may choose the other because the 6 will say, well, I can do that too. Sometimes I do that. And then they have all kinds of patterns that reveal that they're actually a 6 or a 9 or both. And if they have 6 and 9 in the tri-type, wow, they're for sure going to have a minimum of 7 asterisks. And this is what I've done. I had the programmer put in these factors that if they showed up, that it would notify the test taker that they were answering or following patterns used by the 6s and 25% of the 9s. Now, those 9s have 6 in the tri-type, which is why it can be confusing. But the 9, instead of saying, well, I'm going to do it different this time, the 9 is saying, oh, I can do this. And, I do that. And I do that. So they're adding, they're identifying with all points of view, all 9 types. Whereas the 6 is saying, yeah, I can do the other thing too. But more than anything, their need for balance is coming out of doing the opposite. And they're not trying to be difficult. It's part of the defense strategy. Although they will share that they will test the test. They're not sure how the results are going to be used. They'll take a test multiple times. And all these things are perfectly normal. And they're waiting for other people to help them confirm their type. But if you do, then they're going to say, yeah, but I don't do that. And I don't do that. And I don't do that. And that's how you distinguish between 6 and 9. Because 9 say, yeah, I can do that too. Yeah, I do that. But there isn't stress about it. Whereas the 6s will say, well, I don't do that. They're very quick to say what they don't do. So I hope that helps you in your journey. And I look forward to seeing you in the future.